Welcome to Wellness and Wisdom with me, Dr. Nadu Tuakli. Here you can expect to hear conversations about everything women over 40 care about. From optimal wellness and peak performance, from intimacy to travel and finances and more. I will be speaking to interesting women and sometimes men to educate and motivate you to live your best life. If you want to find out more, please head over to my website, drtwakli.com, or subscribe to my blog. You can also read my book, Sex, Sanity, and Sleep. We are in this together. So, welcome back to Wellness and Wisdom. Today I am welcoming back Miss Gaia Van Der Esch, an amazing lady who was charged with making the planet free of poverty, carbon, and exclusion by the year 2030 as managing director of 3.0, which has a staff of over 8,000 in 45 countries. She's someone who's making an impact both locally and globally. Today, she's going to talk to us about the COP28 and her new book, Leading Our Way. She's an executive policy expert and author who is driving change and impact in the public and non-profit sectors through strategic and thoughtful leadership. She's the managing director of 3.0 Foundation. Prior to this, she served as the leader of the G20 Private-Public Alliance for the Advancement of Women's Leadership. She speaks 5 European languages. She has 2 master's degrees, one in international relations and one in public administration. She recently returned from COP28 and she's going to tell us all about it and her new book. More about that later. But first, congratulations on the wedding and the upcoming baby. And despite this, you're still globetrotting. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Nadu. Thanks for having me back. And yes, lots of happening in my life, but that's good. Lots of good things happening.
Yes. Now, for those of you who don't know, the COP28 is the 28th United Nations Climate Change Conference, more commonly referred to as COP28. It's still ongoing, and it started on the 30th of November and is being held in Dubai. This COP28 is supposed to bring the world together at a critical moment for global transformative climate action. Gaia, I see your Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, was there. For those of you who don't know, Gaia is Italian. Were you there as part of the Italian delegation, or were you there with 3.0?
I was there with 3.0, so I was there not with a government hat, but with a civil society non-profit hat, which of course is very different, because if you are a government representative, you're there to negotiate and to discuss what's actually going to be included in the final deal. If you're there as a civil society representative or as a private sector representative, you're kind of on the surrounding of what's happening around the negotiations to try and influence from the outside, but you're not at the negotiation table. So it's a very different type of role, a very different type of engagement if you are government or non-government at COP.
In your estimation, how did it go?
So we need to wait for the final outcome, right, to really judge how it will have gone. It's quite a controversial COP. It's a COP where there's an expectation to keep the 1.5 degrees limit alive, where there is an expectation to have a strong statement of phasing out completely fossil fuels, and where there was an expectation of setting up a fund that can really support developing countries, which are the countries that are suffering the most from climate effects, but are the countries that contributed the least to the climate change crisis we're seeing. So these were the key, let's say, benchmarks of what we expect out of this COP. And it was controversial because it's hosted, of course, in an oil country, in the UAE.
Exactly.
It's controversial because also the president of COP, which is from the UAE, is someone that is very involved in the oil industry. And I'm sure many people that follow a little bit these type of discussions saw that he even did a declaration saying that there's no science behind the need to phase out fossil fuel. So right now there is a big fear that in this COP, they won't be speaking about phasing out fossil fuels, but rather scaling down or, phasing down fossil fuels. So it's not about having a world which has an alternative energy for the future, but maintaining somehow to a different scale the current model that we have, including for energy production. So I know there are tense negotiations going on. I'm now no longer in Dubai. I'm back in Europe. I know there are tense negotiations going on about this phasing out or phasing down of fossil fuels. The positive news is that they did agree on the first day, which was quite uncommon for the COP process, on a loss and damage fund for the countries that are most affected by climate change, but of course don't have necessarily the resources to pay for all the consequences of climate change. So that was established, and it's a good step, but it's not enough, right? It was established. I think more or less the pledges are at 700 million. And that's not much. Like, it's a good sign also that countries like UAE, so countries that are not necessarily seen as the Western world, are also taking responsibility and saying we also put money in this fund. But it's peanuts, right? 700 millions for all the countries, including some countries that will be disappearing from the face of Earth because of rising sea level. It's nothing. So it's a good first step, but it's not enough. We need to multiply that number of committed funds by hundreds of times if we actually want to have it, make sure it has an impact. So mixed feelings about this COP. Let's see what's really going to come out. That's the only moment where you can actually judge the final result of COP, if governments had the courage to be ambitious, to stick to their commitments, to be bold and be also radical in the action we need, or if governments will continue not being as committed as we need them to be to really address the climate crisis. And that's still not clear as of today which one of the two is going to be.
Yeah, and it seems to me that after 3 decades of UN climate summits, it's strange that they've never addressed the future of fossil fuels head on. I mean, we're still trying to squeeze out a policy statement on whether petroleum is good for the planet, even though obviously the fossil fuels are the top source of planet warming emissions. So yeah, I had wondered about it being in Dubai, and we'll see. Like you said, the jury's still out. We can always try and be optimistic.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be optimistic, to continue pushing for change, because we need people that believe that change can happen to push for it, but not naive, right? Being optimistic is not being naive, and we need to see that there are lots of dynamics behind politics which are there, which are at stake, and which might hinder the world and humanity from going into the right direction.
I noticed that the WHO had their first health day associated with COP, which is encouraging. Supposedly, the purpose of that was to discuss how climate change affects our health. The consequences of war, as with climate change, tend not to affect the people who actually cause them. Do you think it's time for a change?
It's definitely time for a change. And actually, myself and many other people that were there because that's the type of change we were hoping to effect and to bring on the table at COP. So climate change is often seen as if it's an isolated thing, as if it's it's just climate change. But climate change is super interconnected, as you're saying, to our health, is super connected also to peace, right? If you look at a lot of conflict often start because there is a lack of resources, there's a lack of water, there is a drought, and there is tension between different groups over how to keep your livestock alive or how to keep yourself alive. There is a huge interconnection between peace, conflict, and with climate change, between health with climate change, between poverty and climate change. Because of course, as we were saying, there are over 2 billion people in the world that live in poverty, that live in countries that have instability, and live in areas that are especially vulnerable to climate change. And that's 1 out of 4 people in the world. That's a huge number.
Right.
And if we see each topic as a complete silo, we're never going to fix. For a person that is living, I don't know, in Somalia, it's not different policy agendas and different people and different organizations that need to deal with my problem linked to climate change or linked to poverty or linked to health, because not having water is going to have an implication on the whole life that you have. And it's not a matter of having a siloed agenda, but it's a matter of understanding that these things are intrinsically connected. So it was very encouraging because it was the first time there was a health day. It was the first time there was a peace and relief day at COP. So these connections are starting to happen. I think there's still a long way for these connections to then actually transform into a much more holistic action on the ground in the field compared to what we have now. The discussion is though happening, and that's an encouraging step. But the problem, I think, with all this discussion around climate change is that all these are encouraging signs, but they are signs and steps that are too late and too little,
and too
because
slow.
the problem at stake is too slow. The problem at stake is so big that we can't be proud and tap ourselves on the shoulder because we introduced the health day. We need to scale it way quicker and be able to do this connection not only by having a health day, but by putting actors that are working on climate change and on health around the same table, do a planning which is comprehensive and really responds to the needs of people. So
and of course,
encouraging,
all these
but
wars
again,
are not helping. I heard last week on the radio that 70% of the people who were killed in the last 2 months in Palestine have been women and children. And it seems that women and children are the worst affected in almost every conflict. Yet, I believe most of the mediators are not women.
Are definitely not women. And I think most is probably even a generous assessment. There are very few peace deals that have been agreed upon in which one woman at all was involved. Most of the mediation and discussions and policy making and decision making is made by man.
Exactly.
And most of the wars, if we look at the wars that exist, it's all like, I don't know, either heads of states that are quite macho, let's say, as a leader, or head of a faction that has a very macho type of mentality. So it's a bit toxic masculinity, I would say. Taking power and showing up, being competitive, being super assertive, being violent against specific factions. If women would be part of the discussion, convinced things would look very different. And as you say, women are not part of the decision making, they're not part of the discussion, but they are the most affected, women and children. And that's the case in wars. That's also the case when it comes to vulnerability to climate change. Women have huge implications in their lives from all these different crises happening, but we don't have a voice to influence them and to be part of the solution and of the decision making.
Yeah, so women helping women to change the new world order and create change at both the macro and the micro level. That's what we had talked about previously. And women are often thought as having good ideas, but not much action. So how do you envisage women's leadership being different to men's?
So that's a question I've been thinking about a lot, of course, as I was writing my book, which is a book, I always say, from women to everyone. It's not a book from women for women. It's a book which I hope women and men can learn from the iconic leaders that are featured in the book, because we all need to learn from that. But the reflection on women leadership is a tricky one in the sense that stereotypically, I would say, or also from my experience, on average, women tend to be more empathetic. We tend to be more relational and careful to relations, to keeping and building relations, let's say, compared to men. We also often have a longer term vision, and that's sometimes associated just to our biological function that, for millennials we've been procreating babies. And so we have this kind of mindset by default that is thinking about next generation. So we think much more long term in terms of decision making, in terms of implications of what we do compared to what a man on average would do. So there are lots of traits that you can associate typically more with women than with men.
Right.
It's very difficult to know how much those traits are nature, how much those traits are nurture or culture, the fact that, we teach our girls to be relational, to be kind, to not be assertive, to not be competitive. Well, we teach our boys to compete with the cars and be assertive and affirm themselves and not cry because otherwise they're girly, right? So there's definitely a social component to it where we encourage certain behaviors in girls and women, and we encourage other behaviors in boys and men, and we reward these behaviors very differently, right? For example, even myself, when I speak my mind and I might be a bit assertive about certain points, I've been called so many times, you're bossy, you're arrogant. And if a guy does exactly the same thing, even more than me, he's confident
Applauded.
and cool, Exactly, he's applauded, and I'm arrogant and bossy, and it's not okay. I'm actually marginalized because of that. When often, and of course I see it from my perspective, but if I compare myself to my male colleagues, I'm less competitive and less arrogant than them. But for them, it's okay. For me, as soon as I say something, I'm already judged, right? So there is a social component to it. There is also partly, it's impossible to know how much, a biologic component to it. I spoke with a primatologist as I was working on the book that has spent his life, of course, observing chimpanzees. He wrote this very interesting book, which is about how there are gender dynamics among primates and what we can learn from primates about gender dynamics in the human species. His name is Frans de Waal. If anyone wants to check him out, he's really interesting and he's a very good communicator. He has a very well-written book. This primatologist told me, for example, if you leave a broom in a cage of a chimpanzee, the guys are going to take the broom, break it into pieces, throw it at each other, and use it as a game somehow. The female chimpanzees are going to take the broom and treat it like a baby and hug it at night and create a little, bed for the broom next to them.
Nurturing.
So there is, exactly. So there is something biological to it. There is for sure a strong social element to it, but it doesn't mean that these traits are only female traits, right? And I really think it's important to put a point on that, because in my book, I try and say we need to rethink leadership. We need to expand the models of leadership. We need to see empathy as a strong point of leadership, not as a weak point. We need to see collaboration as something we need in today's world, not as a weakness. We need to really rethink what leadership means, but it doesn't mean that that's now women's job to always show all of these traits and to be the ones that redefine leadership, right? I think we can learn from women because we do bring something different to the table when we feel authorized to do it, because often we're told off when we try to do it. But everyone has the responsibility of doing this. And these are traits that also men can have, if only we encourage it when they're boys, that if they cry, it's okay. If they're in contact with their feelings, it's okay. And if they're empathetic, it's good. These are things they can bring also when they're leading teams. So the responsibility is for everyone, women and men, to really shift how we think about leadership and learn from women that on average have these traits in a more natural way or in a more socially accepted way. So we can learn from women, but again, everybody must really change mindset and take a step in that direction.
Well, I'm sure you're going to teach your son to be empathetic. So
I'll try.
Tell us about your new book, Leading Our Way, How Women Are Redefining Leadership.
So it's a book that I wrote based on my own experience. So it really stems from my own experiences as a manager, my own experiences as a woman, of course, my own experience as an employee, as a partner. So it's a book that comes from a very, very personal place, I would say, within me, that really tries and be a guide that I wish I had in different stages of my life. I wish I had now as an executive, where often I see that I do things a little differently than other executives, which in most cases is men. And I feel a bit lonely in doing things differently. When you do things differently, they're seen as
not appreciated,
weird, or you get pushed back with them. Exactly, they're not appreciated. So it's a book that as an executive, as a manager, I really think it's interesting because the people, the leaders that are featured in the book, they are women that had a lot of impact on our world and that had a lot of success, that need to navigate a lot of difficulties to get where they got, but that are really doing this hard work of trying to do things differently. And by reading their stories, you feel a little bit less lonely. You learn strategies of how they've managed these difficulties. You feel encouraged to really stand your ground and continue to do things differently, because that's how change can be affected. It's a book that I wish I had in my earlier days of my career, when I had not great managers. And I thought, okay, I guess that's how you manage, right? And I was taught by my managers to be more assertive, to be more bossy, to be more competitive. And I thought, okay, that's, I guess, what I need to do to be a manager. I didn't have different models of management, and I had to figure it out by myself. That's not what I think is good management and what I want to stand for. But it took me time to do that process. And I hope this book can accelerate that for many people that maybe don't have those immediate models of a different style of management within their companies, but they feel that it doesn't match. And I know there's so many people that feel that within their companies, that are like, this is not the culture I would want if I was managing the team. And this book can really give guidance and inspiration that there are different models, and that no matter your level of seniority, you can lead, you can bring these different models, you can bring these different changes. So it's a book that I wrote thinking a bit of myself in the, when I was a bit younger, and now that, of course, I'm still relatively young to be an executive level. But if I look at colleagues and at women and at men that are way older than me at an executive level, I think it's a book that would really benefit different people in different phases of life to hear stories of leadership, to hear the failures that these women had. They're very honest stories. That was my condition. I didn't want to portray some iconic stars and how cool they are, and that's it. I wanted to really dig into the difficulties that we have, because I think that's how other people can relate and can learn. But I also wanted these women to redefine what leadership is. So it's a book that can inspire you, can guide you, can make you relate to different ways of leading, really expand your vision of what leadership looks and acts like.
So can you tell us briefly about the women you interviewed in your book and why you chose them?
Yes, so it was, of course, a very organic process to find all these different women. They're very iconic, high-level women. So I mobilized anyone I could think of in my network, which I want to thank for everybody that helped me make this happen, because it was really like an army of people that came together to get me to these different women. And my criteria for the woman was to have a mix of geographical representation. So to have, of course, Americans, Europeans, but also to have people from Latin America, people from Africa, people from Middle East and Asia. So I really worked hard to keep a bit of a geographical balance, because often the voices that we hear are American super top CEOs or European top CEOs, which are less visible than the Americans on average. But I wanted a bit of a different story that looks at leadership from different cultural perspectives. And so that was one of my main criteria when looking at the different women that I wanted. And another criteria was also looking at women that work in different sectors, because I come from the nonprofit public policy sector. So of course, if I would have followed my heart, I'm a policy geek, I would have probably had all the former prime ministers, right, across the world. But I think that says only one part of the story. There's so much we can learn from people that have never held power, but maybe have led a revolution, or people that were, designers or CEOs, or people that are in the sports world. So really leaders that have different paths in their life and that have a different focus in their life. Because my assumption, which I think then was proven right, but you're going to tell me after you get to read the book, was that it makes it way more interesting. So you will find women that have very different sectors and very different walks of life and come from very different countries. So we have, the first one is Christiana Figueres. Speaking of COP, she was the leader behind the COP in Paris that actually led to the historical climate change agreement. She
Paris
played a
Accord.
crucial role in making that happen. So she's a diplomat from Costa Rica that worked at the highest level of the UN and really pushed this agreement and is still a very vocal voice in the climate change space on how to make bold change and quick change happen. We have Gitanjali Rao. So Gitanjali is from the US.
That she was actually a candidate for United Nations Secretary General in 2015.
And then we have Gitanjali Rao. She's young. She's 17 now. She was the first ever Kid of the Year of Time magazine when she was 13, 14. She's a girl in STEM. She has already done 10, 11 inventions. She's a very fascinating character. She's very innovative. She's very curious. She's very eager to use innovation to fix the world problems. So as you can see, completely different from Christiana Figueres, a completely different generation, completely different focus. Then we have Becky Sauerbrunn, who is the captain of the US football team or soccer team for the Americans, of the national team. And she's a very fascinating character. I think a very interesting leader. She's an introvert. She speaks a lot about leading as an introvert. So if you're an introvert, definitely check out her chapter, because as an extrovert, I found it super fascinating to speak to her and to learn about a different perspective on leadership. There's then Diane Von Furstenberg, who's a very iconic and known designer. She invented the wrap dress back in the 70s. It's now going to be 50 years next year of anniversary of the wrap dress. And she's also becoming philanthropist with time. She's a very strong voice for authenticity and for how women need to be themselves to really change the world we live in.
So Diane Von Furstenberg is very well known in the US. How old is she now?
I would say abundant 70s. She said to me that she likes to say that she's in the sunset of her life. So she wants to use her life as a conduit for other women to emerge. And she also says that she prefers to the question, how old are you, is how much have you lived or how long have you lived? And she always says, I always answer that I've lived 350 years because I've lived so fully that I literally feel I've lived 350 years. But she's in her late 70s.
Yeah, good for her.
Next one, we have Tawakkol Karman. Tawakkol is from Yemen. She actually, which I find it fascinating, the strength that you need to have. She was a key player and leader in the revolution in Yemen in 2011 that led to the fall of the dictatorship in Yemen after over 20 years of dictatorship. She won a Nobel Peace Prize. She was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for this. She's now no longer in Yemen. She can't live there. Yemen has been going through a lot of conflict after the fall of the dictatorship. She worked with many other women on a new constitution where women's rights were granted, but then they started having internal civil war in Yemen. It has gone south since, but she's still engaged to fight for freedom and to fight for equal rights. And she works, of course, from abroad on Yemen, but she also supports many other contexts that need freedom of expression and that need equal rights. She really works hard to advance them. So she's a very fascinating character. The next one is then Comfort Hero. Comfort is the CEO of the International Crisis Group, which is this big think tank working on conflict, on peace, on mediation. So going back to our point of having women looking into this, she's the first, exactly. She's the first Black female CEO of the International Crisis Group. She also, I found her quite fascinating because typically the International Crisis Group has former ministers or prime ministers as their CEOs. Well, Comfort has been an analyst with them for 20 years. So she doesn't come from the corridors of power. She comes from the field. She's Nigerian British. She lived in West Africa most of her adult life, and she worked in West Africa on conflict, on peacemaking, on peace building. And she really rose among the ranks and got to the CEO role. So CEO president, she has this double role. So she's a very interesting personality because she's very different from what you typically have, and she has a way more nuanced view also on the West or global North, global South dynamics in terms of geopolitics. So it's very fascinating to read her words. And then the last but not least is the iconic Gloria Steinem that I think in the US everybody knows about Gloria Steinem. She was one of the icons of the feminism in the United States, and she still is very iconic. She always says, and she also speaks about it in her chapter, that for her it was never herself or her leading. It was always co-leading. It was always a group of women that played a role. Each chapter actually has a title of one key leadership trait that is important to these leaders. And Gloria's chapter is circularity. It's really about how we need to rethink leadership from a hierarchy to a circular movement and to a circular way of approaching decision making and leadership. That's the trick to really shift mentality on what leadership looks and acts like.
Now, I remember back in the days of Gloria Steinem, the notion of women's lib was scoffed at and ridiculed as women being unnecessarily militant. And there are areas of the world where that really hasn't changed much. So it may seem that in the West, a little bit redundant or unnecessary, but when you look at some of the places, for example, Afghanistan, where women basically have no say at all, not even over themselves. But it's a fascinating book. I mean, I can tell this just by listening to you. Can you pick a common thread that goes through all these women? They are obviously all global figures, but how do you go from global to local? Meaning, how do you translate global ideas into local action?
That's a great question, and that's the most difficult thing to do. What I found fascinating that in most of these profiles is that they have this global image, but they're very rooted in their local action. Right? Someone like Gloria Steinem, she spent her life on the road speaking to women, speaking to communities, organizing women in terms of movement. So most of her work has been on the local level. And she also speaks about her story of, her life story of being always on the road since she was a small kid, and how that's where she feels at home when she's on the road, not when she's in her New York home. And that's where her real action happened. Or someone like Tawakkol Karman, she can unfortunately no longer live in Yemen, but she grew up in Yemen. She always lived in Yemen, and her action was to lead a revolution in Yemen with her community of women and men that she managed to organize and mobilize and inspire and create such a huge wave that got the dictatorship to actually leave power after all these years. Or again, I'm thinking, for example, of Gitanjali Rao. She's the girl in STEM. And Gitanjali is someone that really believes we need to make sure that the new generations are on top of technology, not victims of technology, and that, we need to also use technology to get to schools and to children that otherwise wouldn't have the exposure to learn about innovation, about STEM. And so she has, over the years, also during the COVID years, she organized this huge online movement of giving classes or having discussions with schools all over the world to make sure that all children can become innovators and can find that curiosity and can get passionate about STEM as a way of fixing the world problems. So she's someone that spends a huge amount of time in giving workshops to other kids or teenagers her age, because that's where real change happens, right? So I completely agree with you. They're global figures, the figures that have a global stage, and that, of course, by putting it in this book, I'm amplifying the global stage. But maybe because I'm someone that in my job, I'm very action oriented, very pragmatic, very rooted into the local context, I chose people that have these components and that are really trying to make a difference, not only by speaking on the global stage, but also by having concrete actions that can lead change at the local level.
Great. Well, as always, Gaia, it's wonderful talking with you. As I mentioned to you earlier, at least in my area, Amazon was supposed to have released the book this week, but we can't get our hands on it just yet. But you tell me that glitch has been fixed. And so I would encourage everyone to go out and take a look at Gaia's book, which is called Leading Our Way, How Women Are Redefining Leadership. It's, as she says, it's going to be helpful, not just for people who are actually leaders, but for all women to sort of rethink how they approach daily life, actually. Just how maybe you don't think exactly the way your neighbor does, but maybe that's a good thing. So, any parting words for us? New mom to be?
I mean, I would say mom to be, that's going to be, yeah, I'm going to have a little boy in April. So that's going to be an interesting challenge on, educating a boy to, in a way that is respectful, in a way that is empathetic, in a way that he can really be himself. Because finally, I really am very convinced of that. It's not only women that are victims of stereotypes and of gender discriminations. I'm convinced that men are very much victims made by themselves of stereotypes on gender and how men should behave. And I really hope that this book helps break those stereotypes for women, but also for men. And men can feel more authorized to lead in a different way as well, to show some traits that are typically seen as more feminine, that men feel they can't really show. But I actually am convinced that a strong man is a man that is in contact with his own feelings, that has capacity to show empathy, that wants to collaborate because they're secure enough that they don't need to feel in constant competition. That's what the real strong man is to me. I hope this book is something that can help both women and men to break out of these stereotypes, find their way of leading. It's not a golden recipe of how you should lead, and it's not an assertive type of book. It's a book that hopefully will expand our thinking, and you might agree on some parts, you might agree with some of these leaders, you might disagree on other parts, and that's perfectly fine. The book is there for us to reflect, to challenge ourselves, to learn about ourselves, and then to go out there and lead local change. That's what I really hope for everyone to do with this book. After they finish the last page, is to feel empowered to really go out there and lead in their own way.
And hopefully inspire others by spreading the word. So
Definitely.
obviously, as an up-and-coming leader yourself, speaking with these women inspired you. And I'm sure people reading their words also, thank you for sharing, because they too will be inspired.
I really hope so. Thank you so much, Nadu.
Oh, my pleasure. Nice to see you again, Gaia. And good luck with all that's ahead.
Thank you so much.
So hold on to your seats as we zoom towards a 3-0 world. Today we talked about leadership and how women can improve on it, as well as the COP28 conference in Dubai with someone who was there. This is an annual conference, and apparently there were 100,000 attendees this year. Sounds like a lot. I wonder how much change and constructive work actually gets done. Meanwhile, Gaia is working towards changing the world, a person at a time, and attempting to mobilize millions of people towards a world without exclusion, without carbon, and without poverty. As she says, we must be the change we want to see. Her new book is called Leading Our Way, How Women Are Redefining Leadership, and it is available now. Thank you for listening to Wellness and Wisdom with me, Dr. Tuakli. If you want more information, head over to drtuakli.com or subscribe to my blog or my YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this podcast, please click the follow button on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with a friend. Wishing you the best of health and happiness until next time. Bye for now.